My name is Jeremiah, and I need to tell you about the night I decided that death was preferable to one more day in chains. This is the story of how I left the Blackwood plantation in Alabama in the summer of 1858, and why they found 3 men dead and 2 barns burning by the time the sun rose. This is the story of my escape and the blood and fire I left in my wake. I wasn't always a man capable of killing. I was born on the Blackwood plantation 32 years before that fateful night, delivered in a cabin that housed 3 families in conditions that wouldn't have been considered suitable for livestock. My mother, Ruth, worked in the cotton fields from dawn to dusk, her back bent under the Alabama sun that showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of the color of their skin. The plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of the richest soil in Alabama, cotton plants as far as the eye could see during harvest season. Master William Blackwood owned nearly 200 souls, men, women, and children who worked his land, built his wealth, and served his family with the kind of forced devotion that only absolute power can command. The plantation was a world unto itself, with its own rules, its own justice, and its own terrible logic that reduced human beings to units of economic production. I grew up understanding that my life had value only insofar as I could contribute to Master Blackwood's prosperity. As a child, I carried water to the field hands, fed the chickens, and helped tend the vegetable gardens that fed the slave quarters. As I grew stronger, I graduated to field work, learning to pick cotton with the speed and efficiency that meant the difference between adequate food and hunger, between a place to sleep and a night spent under the stars. By the time I reached manhood, I had become one of Master Blackwood's most valuable assets. I could pick 300 pounds of cotton in a single day, more than almost any other man on the plantation. I knew how to repair tools, mend harnesses, and coax extra work from machinery that should have been replaced years earlier. I could read, though I kept that knowledge hidden, having learned from scraps of newspaper and discarded books that found their way to the quarters. My ability to read became both a blessing and a curse. Through stolen moments with newspapers and overheard conversations, I learned about a world beyond the plantation boundaries, a world where men like me could own property, make choices, live as free human beings. I read about the Underground Railroad, about successful escapes, about communities in the North where former slaves built new lives for themselves and their families, but knowledge of freedom only made my bondage more unbearable. Every morning when the bell rang to summon us to the fields, every evening when we returned exhausted to our cramped quarters, every Sunday when Master Blackwood's preacher told us that our suffering was God's will and our duty was obedience, I felt the weight of my chains more acutely. The plantation operated under the supervision of an overseer named Jonas Crawford, a man whose cruelty was legendary, even among neighboring plantations, known for their harsh treatment of enslaved people. Crawford was a small, wiry man with pale eyes that seemed to take pleasure in others' pain. He carried a whip that he used liberally, and he took pride in his ability to extract maximum work from the people under his control through a careful combination of fear, punishment, and the occasional reward that kept hope alive just enough to prevent complete despair. Crawford had taken a particular dislike to me, perhaps because my literacy made him uncomfortable, perhaps because I had grown too large and strong for him to intimidate easily, perhaps simply because he sensed the rage that simmered beneath my outward compliance. He watched me constantly, looking for any excuse to demonstrate his authority, any sign of defiance that he could use to justify the brutal punishment he seemed eager to inflict. The tension between us had been building for years, but it came to a head during the summer of 1858, when a combination of brutal heat, failed crops, and economic pressure made everyone on the plantation more desperate and dangerous than usual. Crawford's temper, never particularly stable, became increasingly explosive as Master Blackwood demanded higher productivity from workers who were already pushed beyond their limits. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in July, when the temperature was already climbing toward what would become a punishing 105 degrees before noon. I was working in the cotton field, moving as quickly as the heat would allow, when I heard a commotion from the direction of the slave quarters. Through the rows of cotton plants, I could see Crawford standing over a figure on the ground, his whip raised high above his head. As I moved closer, I realized with horror that the person on the ground was my younger brother, Samuel, barely 16 years old and slight of build, even for his age. He had been assigned to carry water to the field workers, a job that should have been relatively safe, but apparently had somehow triggered Crawford's wrath. "How spilled water on my boots, boy?" Crawford was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who had found an excuse for violence and intended to make the most of it. "Seems like you need to learn some respect for your betters." Samuel tried to explain that he had stumbled over a root, that the spilling had been accidental, but Crawford was beyond listening to explanations. The first lash across Samuel's back drove the breath from his body and sent him sprawling face first into the red clay soil that would be stained with his blood before Crawford was finished. "That's one," Crawford announced to the field workers who had stopped their picking to watch. "Boy's got 19 more coming, and every one of you better keep working unless you want to join him." But I couldn't keep working. I couldn't stand there picking cotton while my little brother was beaten unconscious for the crime of accidentally spilling water. Something inside me that had been compressed for 32 years finally reached its breaking point. I dropped my cotton sack and started walking toward Crawford, my vision narrowing until all I could see was the man who had made our lives miserable for so many years. The other workers tried to warn me off with gestures and whispered pleas, but I was beyond caring about consequences. All I could think about was the sound of the whip cutting through the air and my brother's cries of pain. "Crawford," I called out, my voice carrying across the field in a way that made everyone freeze. "That's enough. He's just a boy." The overseer turned toward me with an expression of delighted surprise, as if I had just given him an unexpected gift. "Well, well," he said, coiling his whip slowly. "Jeremiah thinks he can give me orders, thinks he can tell me how to discipline lazy slaves who don't know their place." "I'm telling you to stop beating my brother," I said, continuing to walk toward him despite the growing murmur of fear from the other workers. "He made a mistake. Beating him unconscious won't teach him anything except to fear you." Crawford laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. "Fear is exactly what I want to teach, boy. Fear of me, fear of Master Blackwood, fear of what happens to slaves who forget their place. And since you seem to have forgotten yours, maybe you need a reminder too." He raised the whip, and I saw in his pale eyes the intention to strike me down just as he had struck Samuel. But this time, instead of submitting to his authority, instead of accepting punishment for the crime of caring about my family, I did something that changed the course of my life forever. I caught the whip. My hand closed around the leather just inches from my face, and for a moment Crawford and I stood frozen in a tableau that represented everything wrong with the world we lived in. Then I pulled, hard, jerking the whip from his grasp and sending him stumbling backward. "No more," I said, wrapping the leather around my fist. "No more beatings, no more treating us like animals, no more." What happened next was inevitable. Crawford reached for the pistol he kept on his belt, intending to shoot me down where I stood. But years of field work had made me strong and quick, and 32 years of accumulated rage had made me reckless. I was on him before he could clear the weapon from its holster, my hands closing around his throat with all the strength that cotton picking had given me. He fought, scratching at my arms and kicking at my legs, but the anger that had been building inside me for decades gave me a strength that his smaller frame couldn't match. I felt his windpipe collapse under my fingers, felt the life drain out of him as the other field workers watched in stunned silence. When Crawford's body went limp in my hands, I looked around at the faces surrounding me and saw my own death sentence written in their expressions. There was no coming back from what I had just done. There was no explanation that would satisfy Master Blackwood, no punishment short of death that would restore the order I had shattered. But there was also something else in those faces, a kind of awed respect, a recognition that someone had finally stood up to the system that oppressed us all. For just a moment I had shown that our oppressors were not invincible, that their power depended on our willingness to submit. "Run," whispered Mary, an older woman who had worked the field since before I was born. "Run now, while you still can." I helped Samuel to his feet, checking his injuries and making sure he could stand on his own. The welts on his back would heal, but the memory of this day would stay with him forever. "Tell Mama I'm sorry," I whispered to him. "Tell her I couldn't stay and watch them kill us one piece at a time." Then I did something that even now, decades later, I'm not sure I can fully justify. I took Crawford's pistol, his ammunition, and the matches he carried for lighting his pipe, and I began to prepare for a war I knew I couldn't win but was determined to fight anyway. The slave quarters were mostly empty during the day, with everyone except the sick and the very young working in the fields or the big house. I moved quickly through the cabins, gathering supplies I would need for what I was planning, food that wouldn't spoil, blankets, tools that could serve as weapons, anything that might help me survive in the wilderness. But I also gathered something else. Rags soaked in the kerosene that was used for lamps, dry wood that would catch fire quickly, anything that would burn hot and fast. If I was going to leave the plantation, I intended to make sure that Master Blackwood felt the cost of my departure. I started with the cotton barn, the massive structure that held months of harvested cotton waiting to be shipped to market. The building was essentially a giant pile of kindling, and it caught fire so quickly that I barely had time to get clear before the whole structure was engulfed in flames. The cotton that represented months of unpaid labor, thousands of dollars in profit built on our suffering, went up in smoke that could be seen for miles. Next was the equipment barn, where the tools and machinery that kept the plantation running were stored. I doused everything with kerosene before setting it ablaze, watching as plows and harrows and cotton gins were reduced to twisted metal and ash. Without these tools, the plantation would struggle to function even if Master Blackwood could replace the enslaved people who were sure to be scattered or sold in the aftermath of my rebellion. By now, the smoke and flames had been spotted from the big house, and I could hear shouts and the sound of horses being saddled. Master Blackwood and his sons would be coming soon, along with whatever help they could gather from neighboring plantations. I had maybe an hour before they organized a proper search party, maybe less. I used that time to visit one more building, the smokehouse where Master Blackwood kept his prized hams and bacon, the products of hogs that we had raised but were never allowed to eat. This fire was more personal, a direct attack on the family's comfort rather than their economic interests. I wanted them to feel the loss in their daily lives, to be reminded every time they sat down to a meal that their former property had struck back. As the third building burst into flames, I heard the dogs barking in the distance. Master Blackwood kept a pack of bloodhounds specifically trained to track runaway slaves, and I knew that my scent trail would be fresh and easy to follow. But I had planned for this too, having learned from stories of other escapes and the mistakes that had led to capture. I waded into the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the plantation, letting the water wash away my scent, while carrying me downstream toward the dense swampland that bordered the Blackwood property. The water was cold despite the summer heat, and it stung the cuts on my hands from breaking into the buildings, but it would make tracking me much more difficult. Behind me, the plantation was in chaos. The fires had spread to nearby buildings, and I could see tiny figures running back and forth, trying to organize bucket brigades and save what they could. The dogs were baying frantically, but their handlers would need time to figure out where I had entered the water and where I might have emerged. I had perhaps a 2-hour head start, maybe 3 if I was lucky. In that time, I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and the plantation, while avoiding the roads where mounted searchers would have every advantage. My destination was the Great Dismal Swamp, a vast wilderness that straddled the border between Virginia and North Carolina, where runaway slaves could disappear for years among the cypresses and marshes. But first, I had to survive the journey there. The first night was the hardest. Every sound in the forest seemed like approaching footsteps. Every shadow could hide a slave catcher. Every moment of rest felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I traveled by moonlight when possible, following animal paths and creek beds that would leave less obvious signs of my passage. When dawn approached, I found the densest thicket I could locate and tried to rest while remaining alert for any sign of pursuit. The dogs found my trail on the second day. I heard them baying in the distance, their voices carrying that particular note that meant they had a fresh scent. The sound sent ice through my veins, but it also focused my mind on the problem of survival. I couldn't outrun horses and dogs indefinitely, but I might be able to outwit them. I backtracked to a stream I had crossed earlier, then followed it upstream for more than a mile before climbing out on the opposite bank. The detour cost me precious time, but it might confuse the dogs enough to buy me the hours I needed to reach more difficult terrain. The swamp began gradually, the solid ground giving way to marshy areas where water stood between the trees, and the footing became treacherous. This was both blessing and curse. The difficult terrain would slow down mounted pursuers, but it would also slow me down and leave me vulnerable if they caught up. On the third night, they almost did. I was resting in a grove of cypresses, trying to treat the infected cuts on my feet with mud and moss, when I heard voices approaching through the darkness. 3 men on foot, moving carefully through the swamp with lanterns held high, their conversation carrying clearly across the still water. Trail goes cold here, one of them was saying. Dogs lost the scent when he hit the water. He's got to be somewhere close, replied another voice. One I recognized with a chill as belonging to Master Blackwood's eldest son, Richard. Man can't just disappear into thin air. The third voice belonged to a professional slave catcher, one of the men who made their living tracking down runaway property for substantial rewards. He's smart, I'll give him that. But smart ones make mistakes too, especially when they're tired and hungry. We'll find him. They were close enough that I could see their faces in the lantern light, close enough that a careless movement or sound would give away my position. I pressed myself against the trunk of a massive cypress, trying to control my breathing while they searched the area around my hiding place. That's when I saw the fourth man. He was moving separately from the others, trying to circle around behind where he thought I might be hiding. In the darkness, he was almost invisible except for the occasional glint of metal from the knife he carried. This wasn't just a search anymore. They were hunting me with the intention of surrounding and capturing me, dead or alive. I had two choices: remain hidden and hope they moved on without discovering me, or take action while I still had the element of surprise. The safe choice would have been to wait, but something about the way they moved, the casual discussion of what they would do when they found me, triggered the same rage that had led me to kill Crawford. The man trying to flank me passed within arm's reach of my hiding place, his attention focused on the darkness ahead rather than the shadows beside him. I moved as quietly as 32 years of careful survival had taught me, my hand closing over his mouth, while Crawford's knife, which I had taken along with his pistol, found the space between his ribs. He died quickly and quietly, but his lantern fell into the marsh water with a splash that seemed to echo like thunder in the stillness. The other three men turned toward the sound, their own lights swinging in my direction. "Johnson?" called Richard Blackwood. "Are you find something?" I didn't answer, but my silence was answer enough. They knew something had happened to their companion, and they began moving toward my position with the careful urgency of men who realized they were no longer the hunters, but possibly the hunted. I had Crawford's pistol, but it was a single-shot weapon that would leave me defenseless after one use. Against three armed men, my best option was to create confusion and escape in the resulting chaos. I aimed for the largest lantern and fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing across the swamp like thunder. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, setting fire to the moss hanging from nearby trees and casting wild shadows that made it impossible to see clearly. In the confusion that followed, I slipped away from my hiding place and began making my way deeper into the swamp, guided by the faint light of stars reflecting on the water. Behind me, I could hear them calling to each other, trying to organize a response to an attack they hadn't anticipated. But they were city men, plantation owners, and professional trackers who were used to pursuing frightened, unarmed runaways, not someone willing to fight back with deadly force. "He killed Johnson," I heard one of them say, his voice carrying a note of shock that suggested he was just beginning to understand what kind of man they were dealing with. "Burn him out," Richard Blackwood replied, his voice hard with anger and something that might have been fear. "Set fire to the whole damned swamp if we have to. But you can't burn a swamp, especially not one as vast and wet as the wilderness I was entering. They could start fires, but the flames would die out quickly in the moisture-soaked environment, creating smoke that would hide me as much as it would flush me out. I traveled through the night, moving as quietly as possible through water that sometimes reached my waist, avoiding the deeper channels where I might drown and the higher ground where I might be more easily spotted. By dawn, I had put several miles between myself and the scene of the shooting, but I knew they would keep coming. The Great Dismal Swamp was a world unto itself, a vast wilderness where the normal rules of civilization didn't apply. Runaway slaves had been hiding here for generations, some for years at a time, surviving on fish and game, building hidden camps on islands of solid ground, creating communities of the desperate and the determined. I wasn't the first person to seek refuge here, and I wouldn't be the last. The swamp had its own dangers: snakes and alligators, disease-carrying insects, stretches of quicksand that could swallow a man without a trace, but it also offered something that was worth any risk: the possibility of freedom. On my fourth day in the swamp, I found signs that other people had passed this way: a fish trap made from woven reeds, footprints in the mud that were too small to belong to my pursuers, scraps of cloth that suggested someone had made camp nearby. I began following these signs, hoping they would lead me to other fugitives who might be willing to share knowledge of how to survive in this wilderness. The camp, when I found it, was hidden on a small island of solid ground surrounded by channels, too narrow for boats and too deep for horses. 3 men and 2 women, all former slaves from different plantations, all carrying the same look of desperate hope that I felt burning in my own chest. They welcomed me with the cautious friendship of people who understood that survival depended on mutual aid, but who also knew that any stranger might be a spy or a threat. Over the course of several days, as I proved my commitment to the community by sharing my supplies and contributing to the common defense, they told me their stories. There was Marcus, who had escaped from a rice plantation in South Carolina after his wife and daughter were sold to pay his master's gambling debts. There was Sarah, who had fled a Virginia tobacco farm after the overseer's son had tried to assault her, and she had fought back with a kitchen knife. There was Benjamin, who had simply walked away from a cotton plantation in Georgia when he turned 40 and realized he would rather die free than live enslaved. Each of them had left their own trail of resistance, their own acts of defiance that had made their former lives impossible to continue. Some had fought their oppressors directly, others had committed sabotage against property and crops. All had chosen the enormous risk of flight over the certainty of continued bondage. Together, we created a small community based on the radical idea that people like us deserve to make our own choices, to keep the fruits of our own labor, to live without fear of arbitrary punishment or separation from our loved ones. We built shelters from cypress wood and moss, established fishing areas in the deeper channels, created a warning system that would alert us to approaching danger. For 3 months, I lived as a free man for the first time in my life. I woke when I chose to wake, worked on projects that benefited me and my companions, spoke my mind without fear of retribution. The physical hardships of swamp life, the insects, the disease, the constant dampness, seemed like luxuries compared to the psychological torture of slavery. But freedom in a swamp is not the same as freedom in the wider world, and eventually, the desire for a larger life drove me to attempt the journey north to Pennsylvania, where former slaves could live openly and legally. The others in our community made the same choice at different times, some succeeding in reaching safety, others disappearing into the wilderness without a trace. My own journey north took 6 months of careful travel, following the Underground Railroad through safe houses and sympathetic communities, working for short periods to earn money for food and transportation, always moving toward the promise of legal freedom. I was helped by Quakers in North Carolina, free blacks in Virginia, abolitionists in Maryland who risked their own safety to aid people like me. I reached Philadelphia in the spring of 1859, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and the memories of everything I had left behind. The city was full of former slaves like myself, people who had found ways to build new lives despite the trauma of their past experiences. I found work as a blacksmith, my strength and skills from the plantation serving me well in my new profession. I rented a small room, bought my first real bed, learned to read newspapers without hiding the fact that I was literate. For the first time in my life, I earned wages for my work, money that belonged to me and no one else. But I never forgot the people I had left behind, the communities of resistance that had helped me survive, the terrible cost of the freedom I had claimed for myself. I became involved in the Underground Railroad, helping other fugitives make the same journey I had made, sharing the knowledge and resources that had been shared with me. When the war came in 1861, I enlisted in the Union Army as soon as black men were allowed to serve. I fought in Virginia and South Carolina, returning to the very region I had fled, this time as a soldier fighting to end the system that had enslaved me. I survived battles at Antietam and Gettysburg, saw friends die for the principle that all men should be free, witnessed the gradual collapse of the world that had once owned me. After the war, I returned to Alabama as part of the Reconstruction effort, working to establish schools and businesses in communities of former slaves. I found my brother Samuel, now a man with children of his own, and learned that our mother had died the winter after my escape, never knowing whether I had survived or perished in the swamp. The plantation where I had been born was in ruins, the big house abandoned, the fields returning to wilderness. Master Blackwood had died during the war, his sons scattered to other states where they might rebuild their fortunes without the baggage of their family's past. The slave quarters where I had grown up were empty, the people who had lived there dispersed to new lives in new places. I established a school on the site where the cotton barn had stood, the place where my rebellion had begun with fire and destruction. Former slaves from throughout the county sent their children to learn reading and mathematics, skills that would help them navigate their new freedom with confidence and competence. I married a teacher named Grace, a woman who had been born free in Pennsylvania, but chose to come south to help educate the children of former slaves. Together, we raised 3 children who never knew the fear of being owned, who grew up with the assumption that their lives belonged to themselves. I lived to be 78 years old, dying peacefully in my own bed in the house I had built with my own hands on land I had purchased with money I had earned through my own labor. My gravestone bears my full name, Jeremiah Washington Freeman, the surname I chose for myself when I claimed my freedom in the Great Dismal Swamp. The trail of blood and fire I left behind me in 1858 was not something I planned or intended, but it was the price of claiming my humanity in a world that denied my right to exist as anything more than property. I killed men who would have killed me, burned buildings that represented stolen wealth built on stolen labor, chose violence as the only language my oppressors seemed to understand. I won't tell you that what I did was right or wrong, only that it was necessary for my survival and the survival of my hope for something better. The freedom I claimed came at a terrible cost, but it was a cost I was willing to pay rather than spend another day living as someone else's property. This was the story of Jeremiah Freeman, who learned that sometimes the only way to claim your humanity is to prove that you're willing to fight for it, no matter what the consequences might be. I left a trail of blood and fire behind me, but I also left a trail of hope for everyone who came after, proof that even the most powerless person can find the strength to resist when pushed beyond endurance. The echoes of that summer night in 1858 resonate through time, a reminder that freedom is never given freely, but must always be claimed at great personal cost. If these stories of resistance and the price of liberty stir something deep within you, join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more untold truths from the shadows of history, stories of people who refused to accept their circumstances and fought to create something better. Your support helps ensure these crucial narratives of courage and resistance continue to be told. I was 6 years old when I learned what I truly was. Until that morning in the summer of 1847, I thought the world was simply divided between those who lived in the big house and those who lived in the small cabins like ours. I thought Mama worked in the fields because she loved the earth, and I played with the other children because that's what children did. I didn't understand why we couldn't leave the plantation, why Master Johnson's voice made Mama's shoulders tense with fear, or why the white children from town looked at me with such strange expressions when they occasionally visited with their parents. The plantation stretched as far as my young eyes could see, rolling hills of cotton that looked like clouds fallen to earth. Our cabin sat in a row with 20 others, each housing families who worked the land from dawn to dusk. The quarters, as they called our little community, buzzed with life despite the hardships I was too young to fully comprehend. Children played games with corn-cob dolls and wooden hoops, women tended small gardens behind their cabins, and men sat on porches after dark, their voices low and careful. I had friends among the children, especially little Mercy, who was 7 and knew all the best hiding spots, and Thomas, who could climb any tree on the plantation. We would spend our days exploring the edges of the property, always careful to stay away from the big house and the overseer's cabin, though we never really understood why. Mama would watch us play from the doorway of our cabin when she returned from the fields, her face a mixture of love and worry that I couldn't decipher. Our cabin was small but felt like home. 2 rooms, one where Mama and I slept on a straw mattress, and another where we ate our meals and Mama would mend clothes by candlelight. The walls were rough wood that let in slivers of light during the day and drafts at night. We had a small fireplace that kept us warm in winter, and a wooden table that Mama's father had made before I was born. On the walls hung the few possessions we owned: Mama's other dress, a small mirror with a crack down the middle, and a wooden cross that had belonged to her grandmother. Mama was the center of my world. She was tall and graceful, with hands that were gentle when they touched my face but strong from years of field work. Her voice was like honey when she sang me to sleep, telling stories of far-off places and people who lived in freedom. She spoke of cities where people like us walked wherever they pleased, of schools where children learned to read and write, of families who could never be separated. These stories felt like fairy tales to me, beautiful but impossible. The morning that changed everything started like any other. The bell rang before dawn, its harsh clang cutting through the humid Georgia air like a knife. I could hear it from our cabin, that terrible sound that meant another day of work was beginning. Mama stirred beside me on our straw mattress, her calloused hands already reaching for the worn dress she wore to the fields. The fabric was faded from washing and patched in several places, but she wore it with dignity. I rubbed my eyes and stretched, still drowsy from dreams of running free through endless meadows, where no bells rang and no masters watched. In my dreams, Mama and I lived in a house with glass windows and a real bed, and she never had to leave at dawn with her back bent and her eyes tired. "Morning, baby," Mama whispered, her voice carrying that familiar worry I'd grown accustomed to, but never understood. She kissed my forehead, her lips soft against my skin. "You stay close to the quarters today, you hear me? Don't go wandering near the big house like you did yesterday." I nodded, though part of me was already curious about what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of our small world. "Why can't I go there, Mama? The flowers are so pretty, and sometimes I can hear music from the windows." Mama's face grew serious, and she knelt down to look directly into my eyes. Her hands cupped my face gently but firmly. "Because that ain't our place, Samuel. That house belongs to Master Johnson and his family, and we got to stay where we belong. Promise me you'll stay near the quarters today." "I promise, Mama," I said, though I didn't really understand why it mattered. To my 6-year-old mind, the plantation was just one big home where we all lived together, even if some people got to sleep in nicer rooms. Mama gathered her few belongings for the day, a small cloth bundle containing her midday meal, a gourd for water, and the wide-brimmed hat that protected her from the sun. She hugged me close, breathing in the scent of my hair, holding me perhaps a moment longer than usual. "Be good for Miss Ruth today," she said, referring to the elderly woman who watched over the youngest children while their parents worked. "Mind what she tells you, and don't give her any trouble." As Mama walked toward the fields with the other workers, I watched from our doorway. The procession was always the same, men and women walking with purpose but without joy, their tools over their shoulders, their faces already resigned to another day under the burning sun. They moved like a river flowing toward the cotton fields, steady and inevitable. Miss Ruth gathered us children under the big oak tree that provided shade near the quarters. She was ancient by my standards, probably 50, with grey hair wrapped in a colourful head wrap and eyes that seemed to see everything. She told us stories while we played, taught us songs, and kept us out of trouble with gentle but firm discipline. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and that day it proved stronger than my promise to Mama. While Miss Ruth dozed in the afternoon heat and the other children played quiet games in the shade, I found myself drawn to the grand white columns of Master Johnson's home. I'd always wondered what lay beyond those tall windows that gleamed like jewels in the sunlight, wondered about the music I sometimes heard drifting from within, wondered why the house looked so different from our small cabins. The big house sat on a small hill, surrounded by gardens that were more beautiful than anything in our quarters. There were roses in colors I'd never seen, trimmed hedges that formed perfect squares, and pathways made of white stones that gleamed in the sun. It was like stepping into one of Mama's fairy tales, a world of beauty and order that seemed untouched by the dust and weariness of the quarters. I was crouched behind the rose bushes, marveling at flowers I'd never seen so close, when I heard voices approaching. The sound of boots on wood made me freeze, and I pressed myself deeper into the shadows of the garden. Master Johnson's voice was unmistakable, loud and commanding even in casual conversation. Master Johnson emerged onto the porch accompanied by another man I didn't recognize. The stranger was shorter and stockier, with a sun-weathered face and clothes that marked him as someone from another plantation. They both carried themselves with the easy confidence of men who were accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Beautiful morning," the stranger said, surveying the plantation with approval. "Your crops are looking fine this year, Johnson." "Thank you," Master Johnson replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt near where I hid. The brown stream landed just inches from my hiding spot, making me hold my breath. Though I'm having some issues with productivity, some of my people are getting too comfortable, thinking they can slack off. The stranger nodded knowingly, his fingers playing with something leather that hung from his belt. "Happens to the best of us. Slaves get complacent when they're not reminded of their place regular-like. You got to show them who's in charge, especially the women. They get ideas above their station if you're not careful." "That's exactly the problem," Master Johnson said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "There's one in particular, Sarah, who's been moving too slow in the fields. Ever since she had that boy, she thinks she's special somehow. Acts like having a child gives her some kind of privilege." My heart began to race as I realized they were talking about Mama. I pressed closer to the ground, trying to make myself invisible while straining to hear every word. "Children complicate things," the stranger agreed, "but they can also be useful for teaching lessons. Nothing motivates a mother like seeing her child disciplined, makes them remember their place real quick." Master Johnson laughed, a sound that made my stomach twist with unnamed dread. "You know, that's not a bad idea. The boy's been getting too bold anyway, wandering around where he doesn't belong. Time both of them learned some respect." The stranger pulled the leather object from his belt, and even from my hiding place I could see it clearly now. It was a whip, coiled like a sleeping snake, the leather worn smooth from use. He held it casually, as if it were nothing more than a walking stick. "This usually does the trick," he said, letting a few inches of the whip unfurl. "Nothing teaches respect like a good lashing, and if you do it in front of the others, well, that's a lesson the whole plantation remembers. Time to remind them all of their place," Master Johnson said, straightening his jacket with the air of a man preparing for important business. "The fields are the perfect place for this kind of education. I should have run then. Every instinct Mama had tried to teach me screamed to flee back to the safety of the quarters, to Miss Ruth and the other children, to anywhere but this garden where men planned lessons in pain. But I was frozen, watching as they strode toward the fields with purpose that made the very air seem to thicken with approaching storm. Something deep in my chest told me that whatever was about to happen would change everything, that the world I thought I knew was about to reveal its true face. I followed at a distance, my bare feet silent on the red dirt path, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The cotton fields stretched before me like an ocean of white, row upon row of plants, heavy with bowls that caught the sunlight like stars. Among them moved the field hands, their dark figures bent to their work, moving with the rhythm of people who had done this same task thousands of times before. The sight had always seemed peaceful to me, like a dance choreographed by the seasons themselves. But now, watching Master Johnson and his companion approach with their terrible purpose, the fields took on a different character. I could see how isolated each worker was among the endless rows, how vulnerable they were to whatever justice or injustice might find them. The cotton that had seemed beautiful now looked like a maze designed to trap rather than shelter. Mama was working in the third row from the path, her movements efficient and steady, despite the heat that was already becoming oppressive. She looked so small among the endless white rows, her dark skin glistening with sweat under the merciless sun. Her picking sack was already half full, evidence of the hard work she'd been doing since dawn. When Master Johnson's voice cut through the morning air like thunder, every head in the field turned toward him. "Sarah, get over here now." The change in Mama's posture was immediate and heartbreaking. Her back straightened as if struck, and her hands trembled as she set down her picking sack. Her eyes found Master Johnson's face first, reading something there that made her expression crumble, then darted to me, lurking at the field's edge. The terror in her expression was something I'd never seen before, raw and desperate and ancient. She walked toward him on unsteady legs, each step seeming to require enormous effort. The other field workers had stopped their picking but kept their eyes carefully averted, their faces masks of forced ignorance. Everyone knew something terrible was about to happen, but no one could risk being seen as too interested. "Yes, Master Johnson," Mama said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She stood with her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped in front of her like a child called to account for some misdeed. "Been talking to the overseer about your productivity, Sarah," Master Johnson said, his voice deceptively calm. "Seems you're not meeting your quota these days. Moving too slow, not picking your fair share, that true?" "No, sir, Master Johnson," Mama replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working hard as I can, sir. Pick from dawn to dusk every day, just like always." "Well then, maybe the problem is your attitude," he said, beginning to pace in front of her like a predator circling prey. "Maybe you think having that boy makes you special somehow. Maybe you think you deserve special treatment." "No, sir," Mama said quickly, desperation creeping into her voice. "I don't think nothing like that, sir. I know my place. I just been doing my best, same as always." "Your best isn't good enough anymore, Sarah," Master Johnson said, stopping directly in front of her. Time you had a reminder about what happens to slaves who don't pull their weight. The stranger stepped forward then, the whip unfurling in his hands with a sharp crack that made birds scatter from nearby trees and sent ripples of tension through the watching field hands. It was then that I truly understood what I was seeing, though I'd never witnessed anything like it before. The whip moved through the air with a whistle that seemed to steal all other sound from the world. "Please, Master Johnson," Mama said, her voice breaking. "I'll work harder. I'll do better. Please don't—" "Too late for pleading, Sarah," he said coldly. "You need to learn, and everyone else here needs to watch you learn. Strip." The word hit me like a physical blow, though I didn't fully understand its implications. Mama's face went ashen, and she glanced desperately around the field as if looking for escape or rescue that wasn't there. The other workers had turned away now, unable to watch but afraid to leave. With shaking hands, Mama removed her worn dress, folding it carefully, as if the simple act of maintaining dignity in this moment of humiliation could protect her somehow. She stood in her thin undergarments, her arms crossed over her chest, tears already streaming down her face. "Turn around," Master Johnson commanded. "Face the cotton." When the first lash fell, the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The crack of leather against flesh was sharp and immediate, followed by Mama's cry of pure agony that pierced straight through my chest. She stumbled forward but managed to stay on her feet, her hands pressed against her knees to steady herself. "That's one," Master Johnson said calmly, as if he were counting coins rather than measuring out pain. "You got 9 more coming, and every person in this field is going to watch every single one." I wanted to run to her, to throw myself between Mama and that terrible leather snake, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching the worst thing I could imagine happening to the person I loved most in the world. Each crack of the whip seemed to tear something inside my chest, each of Mama's cries echoing in my bones. The second lash opened a line across her shoulder blades, and I could see blood beginning to seep through her undergarments. The third brought her to her knees, her hands clutching at the red dirt for support. By the fourth, she was sobbing openly, her dignity stripped away along with her strength. "Please," she gasped between lashes. "Please, I got a child. He needs me." "That child is property, same as you," Master Johnson replied, raising his arm for the 5th strike. "And property doesn't have needs, it has functions." By the 5th lash, Mama had collapsed completely, curled on her side in the dirt between the cotton rows. Her back was a map of red lines, some bleeding, all promising to leave scars that would remind her of this moment for the rest of her life. Her sobs were quieter now, as if the pain had stolen her voice along with her strength. It was then that Master Johnson's eyes found me cowering behind the cotton plants at the field's edge. His face changed, taking on an expression of cruel satisfaction, as if my presence had just given him a wonderful idea. "Well, well," he said, coiling the whip slowly in his hands. "Look who's been watching the whole show. Come here, boy." The words hit me like ice water, freezing my blood and making my vision blur with terror. I shook my head frantically, finally able to move, but only to back away deeper into the cotton rows. "No, sir," I whispered, my voice cracking with fear. "I didn't do nothing wrong, I was just—" "Come here now," he interrupted, his voice taking on the edge of real menace. "Or your mama gets 10 more lashes, and I'll make sure they're twice as hard as the ones she already took." The threat stopped me cold. I looked at Mama lying in the dirt, trying weakly to push herself up, her eyes pleading with me to run, while also begging me not to let her suffer more because of me. The choice was impossible and immediate, and I made it the only way a 6-year-old could. On trembling legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, I walked toward Master Johnson. Each step felt like walking toward the edge of the world, toward a cliff I would never be able to climb back from. The field hands watched me with expressions of sorrow and helplessness, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. "That's better," Master Johnson said as I came within reach. His hand fell on my shoulder, heavy and possessive, fingers digging into my small bones. "Now you've been watching your mama get disciplined for not doing her job properly. You understand why she's being punished?" I stared up at him, confused and terrified. "She works real hard, sir, every day from when the bell rings till it gets dark." "That's not the point, boy," he said, his grip tightening. "The point is she works for me, and if I say she's not working hard enough, then she's not working hard enough, you understand? I own her, just like I own this land, just like I own this cotton." The word "own" echoed strangely in my head, I'd heard it before in relation to things, but never in relation to people. Own her? That's right. Your mama is my property. She belongs to me, same as my horses, same as my tools, same as my cotton. He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the final blow. Same as you. The word property hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs. I'd heard it before, but never understood it applied to people, to me, to Mama. The concept was too large and terrible for my young mind to fully grasp, but I felt its weight settling over me like a blanket made of chains. But I'm a person, I said weakly, the words sounding uncertain even to my own ears. You're whatever I say you are, Master Johnson replied, and I say you're property. You don't get to choose where you live, what you eat, what work you do, or even who you talk to. Those are my choices to make because I own you. The world suddenly felt smaller, the sky lower, the air harder to breathe. Everything I thought I knew about my life was crumbling around me, revealing a structure of control and ownership that had been invisible to my innocent eyes. Now, Master Johnson continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher delivering a lesson, property that doesn't behave properly gets disciplined. Your mama wasn't behaving properly, so she got disciplined. You've been wandering around where you don't belong, so you need to be disciplined too. But I was just looking at the flowers, I protested, my voice breaking. I didn't hurt nothing. Doesn't matter what you were doing. Matters that you were doing it without permission. He gestured to his companion, who was cleaning blood from the whip with a casual indifference that made my stomach turn. Young ones learn best through experience. This way, you'll remember the lesson. Before I could react, before I could run or beg or do anything to change what was happening, he'd taken the whip from his companion. The leather felt different when it struck my small back, sharper and more personal than anything I'd ever experienced. Pain exploded across my shoulder blades like fire, like being struck by lightning, like every nightmare I'd ever had made real. I cried out and stumbled forward, my hands hitting the red dirt as my legs gave out. The taste of earth and salt tears filled my mouth, and for a moment the world went white with shock and agony. I'd never known that bodies could hurt this much, that pain could be so complete and overwhelming. That's so you remember, Master Johnson said, his voice floating down from what seemed like a great height. You don't get to wander wherever your curiosity takes you. You don't get to make decisions about your own life. You work when I say work. You eat when I say eat. You sleep where I say sleep. You live how I say live. Through my tears and the burning fire across my back, I tried to understand what he was telling me. My world, which had seemed so simple that morning, was revealing itself to be a cage I'd never seen because I'd never tried to leave it. You understand me, boy, he demanded. I nodded through my sobs, unable to speak past the pain and fear. I understood more than he knew. I understood that the games I'd played with Thomas and Mercy weren't games at all, but the brief illusion of freedom granted to children too young to work. I understood that Mama's worry wasn't about my safety, but about my awakening to the truth of our lives. I understood that the fear in her eyes wasn't concern, but terror for what I would become as I grew into the reality of slavery. Good, he said, tossing the whip back to his companion with the casual air of a man finished with a minor chore. Now, help your mama get back to work. Both of you better meet your quotas from now on, or we'll have this conversation again. And next time, it won't be just one lash for the boy. I crawled to where Mama knelt in the dirt, her dress torn and bloodied, her body shaking with pain and rage and helplessness. She pulled me against her chest, despite her own injuries, her tears falling into my hair as she whispered apologies I didn't understand, and promises she couldn't keep. We held each other there in the red Georgia clay, two pieces of property comforting each other under the indifferent sun, while around us, the field hands slowly returned to their picking. The cotton still needed to be harvested, quotas still needed to be met, and the machinery of the plantation continued its relentless operation as if nothing significant had happened. That evening, back in our small cabin, Mama tended our wounds with water warmed over our meager fire and strips torn from her only other dress. Her movements were careful and gentle, her touch a balm against the physical and emotional trauma of the day. By candlelight, she cleaned the blood from my back and tried to explain the inexplicable. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered as she worked. I'm so sorry you had to see that, had to feel that. I tried to keep you from knowing for as long as I could. Why didn't you tell me before, Mama? I asked, my voice small and confused. "Why didn't you tell me we were property?" She was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on my shoulders. "Because you were still just a baby, Samuel. Because I wanted you to feel free for as long as possible, even if it wasn't real freedom. Because I hoped maybe things might change before you got old enough to understand." "What kind of change?" I asked, turning to look at her face in the flickering candlelight. She looked older than she had that morning, as if the day had aged her beyond her years. "There's a world out there, beyond this plantation, where people like us don't belong to anybody but ourselves, where children can play wherever they want and learn to read and write and choose their own lives. Is that real, Mama? Or is it just stories?" "It's real, baby. Somewhere out there, it's real." She pulled me close, careful of both our injuries. "And someday, maybe someday, we might see it ourselves." But as I lay on our straw mattress that night, feeling the sting of torn flesh and the deeper ache of shattered innocence, I wondered if someday was just another word for never. The whip had taught me more than Master Johnson intended. It had taught me that some cages are invisible until you try to leave them, that some truths are too heavy for small shoulders to bear, that freedom was not the absence of chains, but the presence of choices I would never be allowed to make. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my dreams of running through endless meadows, but they felt like memories from another life, from another boy who had never felt the kiss of leather on his skin or heard himself described as property. That boy had died today in the cotton field, and in his place lay someone harder, someone who understood the true shape of the world and his place in it. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me was Mama humming a low, mournful song, her voice carrying pain and hope in equal measure. It was a song her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, passed down through generations of women who had learned to find comfort in sorrow and strength in suffering. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of work in the fields, another day of being property. But tonight, in the darkness of our small cabin, her song reminded me that even property could dream, even slaves could love, even the whipped could heal. The scars on my back would fade with time, but the knowledge they carried would remain forever. I was 6 years old when I learned what I truly was, but I was also 6 years old when I learned that being property didn't make me less than human, that being owned didn't mean I couldn't love or hope or dream of something better. The whip had marked my body, but it couldn't touch the part of me that belonged only to myself, the secret self that would grow stronger with each passing day. Years would pass before I truly understood the weight of that first lesson, before I learned that the whip was just the beginning of an education in survival that would shape every day of my life. I would see friends sold away, watch children born into bondage, witness the daily grinding machinery of slavery that reduced human beings to units of labor and profit. But I would also see acts of quiet rebellion, moments of dignity preserved in impossible circumstances, love that flourished despite every attempt to crush it. I would learn that resistance could take many forms, from the obvious ones like running away, to the subtle ones like holding on to hope when hope seemed foolish. I would grow to understand that Master Johnson's lesson that day had been incomplete. Yes, I was property in the eyes of the law and in the structure of the society that surrounded us, but I was also a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams that no whip could reach, no master could own, no system could completely control. The 6-year-old boy who had walked into that cotton field thinking the world was simple had been replaced by someone who understood its terrible complexity. But complexity, I would learn, contained possibilities that simplicity never could. In the spaces between the lashes, in the moments between the orders, in the quiet hours of the night when masters slept, there was room for the human spirit to preserve itself and plan for better days. This was the story of Samuel Washington, though I wouldn't learn my full name until much later, when freedom made such things possible. I would spend 32 more years on that plantation, watching seasons change and cotton grow, learning the intricate dance of survival that slavery demanded. I would see the war come and the world shift beneath everyone's feet, witness the collapse of the only system I had ever known, and the terrifying, exhilarating birth of something new. I lived to see freedom, not just as a dream, but as a legal reality, though the scars of slavery would remain long after the chains were broken. I married Sarah Ruth, the girl from the neighboring plantation, who had taught me that love could exist even in the worst circumstances. Together we raised 4 children, who never felt the sting of a master's whip, never heard themselves described as property, never had to learn the terrible lessons that had shaped my childhood. I worked the same fields as a free man, owned the same land where I had once been owned, and helped build the church where former slaves and their children could gather to worship without asking permission. I died in 1923, an old man who had seen both the worst and best of what humanity could offer, surrounded by grandchildren who knew my story but would never live it themselves. I was buried in the small cemetery behind that church, under a headstone that bore my full name and the dates of my birth and death, but not the years of my slavery. Because in the end, those years were not the measure of my life, but simply the starting point of my journey toward becoming fully human in a world that had tried to convince me I was nothing more than property. The echoes of that first whip, of that 6-year-old boy's brutal awakening, resonate through time, a stark reminder of childhood lost and resilience found. If these untold stories of survival and the unbreakable human spirit stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from America's complex past, stories of people who refused to be reduced to their circumstances, who found ways to preserve their humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Your support helps us keep these important narratives alive and honors the memory of those who suffered so that we might understand the true cost of freedom and the strength of the human heart.